Hello.
Hi
Hi,
there.
Haley. How are you? I'm
I'm
Alex
good, thank
Segura.
you.
Oh, yeah. So happy to be here with you. I'm Alex Segura. I'm the acclaimed author of Secret Identity. I am super excited to. Oh, thank you. Yes, good work. Not a paid promotion. Um, I am honored and thrilled to be in conversation with Hayley Scrivenor, the author of Dirt Creek, which is the Barnes and Noble monthly mystery pick, and this is our midday mystery chat, which happens every month, but our first together. And yeah, I really love the book. I was pretty thrilled when I was asked to lead this discussion, and just a few quick housekeeping things. We do have the option to ask questions, and if you just push the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom presentation, and you can ask questions, and I'll get to those. I am going to selfishly ask my own questions first to get things going, but we'll have plenty of time to get to your questions, and I have some questions as well that were pre-submitted. Also, if you have not picked up your copy of Dirt Creek, no shame. You can pick it up at your local Barnes & Noble or barnesandnoble.com, but please do so just to get in on this amazing, amazing novel. And also this week is the official kind of paperback launch for the book. Am I right?
That sounds sure. Let's go with
Sure.
that.
Yeah, it's early where you are, so you're
yeah.
more pliable than usual, I guess, in terms of. But yeah, Hayley, do you want to just give us all kind of your origin story? This is your debut, so I'd love to hear how you got to this point.
Yes. So, first of all, thank you so much. I'm so excited to chat to you. I loved Secret Identity.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, my pleasure.
And and it was very worth getting up early in the morning where I am to have this conversation. So, look, Dirt Creek actually started as a short story, and I was meant to be writing another book as part of a PhD in creative writing at my local university. I live in a place called Wollongong on the east coast of Australia. And what happened, it was just this group of kids coming home from school, and I suddenly had all this. I'd been really struggling with the other project, and which funnily enough was meant to be set in space. It was a whole other thing. It was a whole other
awesome.
novel. It was, yeah. And so, but when I started writing these kids and they were coming home from school, it had that feeling, when something happens on a particular day and later you remember where you were and what you were doing.
Mm-hmm.
So something bad might happen in your community, or there are big ones that we've all kind of lived through, I think. And so I thought, well, if all the kids are remembering what they were doing that day, how they got home from school that day, then something bad must have happened. And almost fully formed in that moment, I had this idea that Esther Bianchi would be missing. And I also knew what happened to her. And that felt like a novel length to tell that story. And I didn't know any of the sort of other particulars. I didn't have a good sense of other characters yet.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing that what had happened to her seemed like that was a story that would take a novel to tell. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So I'm asking selfishly because I did something similar recently. So did you kind of take the opportunity of the short story to work out some of the kinks and kind of get you started with the book, or?
I mean, that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah.
And certainly if I were a more efficient and better writer, I might have done that. Instead, the book grew very slowly from, that original chapter was in what I think of as the chorus voice. So it was all the kids saying, we did this and we did that, which
Right.
is very unusual in fiction, right? So, and that was what I was looking at in my PhD. I was really interested in that way of telling stories because it's very unusual to tell a story as a group, actually. Most of the time, in novels, it's like he went over there or I went over there, but to say we went over there is instantly interesting to me because it's like who's inside the we and who's outside of that collective, so I actually wrote a lot of the book in that voice first because that's what I was sort of I wrote a lot of stuff that I didn't end up using, but I think it really did give me a sense of I guess the impact of someone going missing on the whole town. And I think that's what I love about those sections now is that they really allow us to see how the emotional kind of mood is and how that affects people in ways that you don't necessarily even expect. Like people have different feelings about it. But then I realized after not too long that, I think for me, the heart of book is character. Like it's getting to know the people and really, so that voice was great for mood and kind of place, but I realized I wanted this missing girl. I wanted us to get to know her through people that loved her, that know her really well. And that's when I started introducing the characters that are now kind of the main voices of Dirt Creek. So we've got her best friend, Ronnie, who I will confess is very close to me. She's a sort of chubby kid who's always thinking about where her next snack is coming from. You know, and she loves Esther.
It's relatable. I think about it all the time.
She idolizes her best friend, I think. And so she's a character that I felt she was kind of my first entryway into that. And then slowly I added people like Lewis, who's a young boy who sees Esther on the day she goes missing, but is too afraid to talk about what he's seen for his own reasons. You know, he's hiding a secret. And then there's the mother of the missing girl, Constance. She's having a really hard time in this book, and she was quite a difficult character to write, but I think she gives us when a child goes missing, I think you need that. That's an important part of the story of what's going on. And then finally, we have Detective Sergeant Sarah Michaels, who I really think is the only person who could come into this small town and kind of figure out what's happened. She has this capacity to understand what people are capable of, I think. Yeah, no,
it's really filled with so many memorable characters. But I am curious about your personal story kind of coming to this book. You know, could you tell us a little bit about your background and you know, what made this the moment for you to kind of start crafting this novel?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think I was not one of those kids who grew up wanting to be a writer, simply because I held books in such high esteem. I assumed there had to be some birthmark that was like lit up by UV light, or the moon at a certain, you know, like I thought if you were meant to be a writer, you would know there would be a magic like symbol that would illuminate and tell
like
you,
a Green Lantern ring.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you would someone would inform you, right? And then so I loved reading passionately, and but then I went to my local university, and I was doing languages. Actually, I studied like Mandarin Chinese, which I'm now terrible at, and French. So I loved words. I guess I was interested in how that works. But and this is going to sound mean, but honestly, I started volunteering with my local writers' festival, which I would go on to become a festival director of. I ended up running the festival for a couple of years, and that's when I realized like they will let anyone be a writer. And I don't say that in a mean way. I just mean the one thing that all the writers I met had in common is that they had found a way to give themselves permission to do that work. And in fact, there was no birthmark, there was no magic, you know, symbol. What they had in common is they'd found a way to sit there and try and tell a story that they cared about. And so very quickly, like within a couple of years of that realization, I quit my full-time job. I got a tattoo of a quill and ink to like remind myself that this is why I had quit the job. And I enrolled in a PhD at my local university. And I'm not sure how it is in the US, but here it seems like a pretty sweet deal. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship, and then I could write my novel. I had to also do a long essay. It was like 40,000 words of sort of academic theory, narrative theory. But then I had the space and time to write a book. And so I went from kind of, I don't know if I can do this, to like, okay, I'm blowing up my life, because it turns out that I'm allowed to do this very quickly. And
no, that's amazing.
Yeah. So the book really began with a sense of, okay, I do need to like turn in a book in a few years. It ended up taking me 5 years all up to the actual sort of, and that's not sort of including editing that I did with the publisher. But it was very much, like I said, it was when I started writing about a place I knew really well from my childhood, actually, that I realized like, this could be, this feels like there's enough here that it could one day be a novel. Whereas I was a massive like Douglas Adams fan. I was a big, like, I really love writers who can be funny. But the thing is, you figure out like you kind of are the writer you are, and you're it's more like you're excavating what you can do rather than deciding what you can do. Sometimes I don't know if you feel that way.
Yeah, no, I think it's such a great point, because I do feel like we discover ourselves as we write. You know, we kind of sift through our influences, and then underneath all that is what you are. And I mean, I love humor too. I'm just not a funny writer. You know, I can write some humor, but it's definitely not the at the heart of what I do. So it's interesting that you said that. I'd love to, you know, setting for me, especially with crime fiction, is such an important element. Like there's the cliche of the setting as a character, but I think you do that really well. And it feels so much like Dirt Creek could only happen in this place. And you give us such a very intimate tour of not only the people, but every aspect of the setting. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the backdrop of Dirt Creek.
Yes, so I do think that if you can take the setting out of a book, like you probably haven't got enough of the place, right? Like it should act upon the characters in such a way that everything kind of not only makes sense in that context, but I definitely think there's the fact that we're in a small isolated town, and that was an experience I really felt like I could draw on, because when you're a kid and you live in a small country town, like you can go nowhere without kind of external support, right? Like it's so far away from other things that unless someone drives you somewhere else, you are there.
Right.
And I think that's a great setting for a novel like this one, a mystery, because there's a sense of here are the people that it kind of could be. There's still the possibility that it's someone who's come from the outside. But what I love about the town of Durton and this idea of Dirt Creek, which of course is, so for anyone who hasn't read it, the kids call the town, which is Durton, Durton, they call it Dirt Town, because I think kids always come up with those kind of great playground nicknames.
Right.
And by that logic, of course, Durton Creek becomes Dirt Creek. And so this idea that it was a space that, I guess I just had all these feelings about that, about being forced to kind of be with people who I wasn't sure saw me or were kind of connected with me. And then the flip side of that also, like, it can be really nice to be in a small community. And there are, like, I had a really good childhood riding my bike around and no one ever abducted me, you know, like, and I like to say, like, it's not based on any personal experience I had with someone going missing. But it certainly was a place for me to put feelings of, like, how did I feel about this place? What is this place? You know, what is it when people close to you kind of decide who you are or think they know you, and when that doesn't quite match with your sense of yourself. And I think every character in Dirt Creek is kind of dealing with that. And then, you know, I think it's worth saying, if there are any emerging writers out there, also it's really useful to set your first book in a place you know really well. Yeah. Because like Ronnie's house is my house, the swimming pool is where the swimming pool was, the school is where the school was. And I did move some things around to the point where in editing, someone kind of drew me a map of like where I'd said things were, and it wasn't
that's
working.
Cool.
And I was like, oh no, like this is not, you know, but it all worked out. And it helped having the kind of real geography to refer back to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so fascinating. I think setting really works and feels alive. It's a textural thing. You want the reader to feel like they're either being transported somewhere new that they can explore through your book, or are familiar with the place. Like my first series was set in Miami, where I was from, and I totally agree with you. It has to, you know, you write what you know because you want to be accurate and you want to give that feeling of genuine experience. And I think you do that with the book. I just want to remind everyone watching at home that you can ask your questions. You just push the Q&A button and we will try to get to it as best we can. And yes, Dirt Creek is our monthly mystery pick, and this is our midday mystery chat with Hayley. I'd love to hear about, you know, I obviously, we as writers, we have our influences, the people that serve us as over time, over whatever amount of books. But I want to talk about the influences on this novel, like were there films or were there novels you were reading or research you were doing that kind of really had an impact as you were writing Dirt Creek?
Yeah, it's funny because I hear some people talk about their influences and it makes total sense. It's like you take this plus this and then you get the thing that you created, which makes total sense, right? Mm-hmm. And then kind of like I was saying before, like my influences originally were people like Douglas Adams, or I love the Norwegian writer Knausgaard or Knausgaard, however you say it. You know, like I was consuming a lot of stuff that was not crime and not sort of to the point where I was like, oh my God, it's like a small town with you know, but there are big, like there's like a dark history or whatever, or there's big lies, and literally I thought that was new, you know, like I hadn't read enough crime to know that like this is quite a common setting, and I hadn't heard of Jane Harper yet, which sounds insane now. But,
no, I mean, I didn't want to presume and say, oh, this was an influence, but it's so funny when things Attica Locke told me this once, like when I told her that something she said inspired one of my books. She said our books are always in kind of conversation with each other, even when we don't know it. And so I think it's less about. It almost feels like a lot of stuff has been done, and it's almost about how you do it. And I feel like you did that in a unique way. It didn't feel like it was just one of many.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I also, I do think I think once you get something about the characters and that emotional truth and the story you want to tell on the page, I do think one of the joys of writing into the mystery genre is that at a certain point, I really had to pull my boots up and go, okay, I have kind of made a promise to the reader that they are going to find out what happened to Esther. And I may not have realized that at the time, that in the sort of situation of that story that came to me literally in less than a second, almost it became obvious to me as more people read it that there were things that that the reader wanted, and I didn't want to frustrate them in that sort of desire. I did want there to be some resolution.
Yeah, you need that.
And I think what's great about mystery is that there are so many kind of constraints in a way, but those constraints can force you into a really creative place. And so
yeah,
I really.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I think one of the things you did really well is you gave that resolution without spoiling anything, because there was a question before the event started, like, is this going to have a spoiler in it? And this is definitely an event to entice people to buy and read and enjoy. And if you have read it, great. But I think you did give that resolution without making it overly tidy, which I appreciate as a reader. I think you want it to feel real, and in real life, not all plot threads are resolved after X amount of time.
No, and I think there are definitely books where that is what you expect, and that's part of the joy of the book too. Like, I think what's been so nice about learning more and reading more broadly in crime and mystery is this idea that that box can be a really fruitful place to kind of play on the edges of, jump outside of, jump back in. There's and for me, it was a real discipline and a real joy. Like it was hard work, because I'm not naturally a plotter. I'm not naturally someone who, and I didn't plan the book in advance beyond knowing, I guess, who had committed the crime that's at the heart of the novel, which is helpful. Like, I'm really glad I knew that, because otherwise I think I could have just wandered off into the wilderness and never been seen again. But it was, I guess, for me, I spent a lot of time getting into character, and I read books kind of almost specifically for different characters. So Lewis, for example, I said I like the Norwegian writer Nausgaard. Yeah. Lewis is a young boy who has a really sort of troubled home life, and so I was reading a lot of Nausgaard, who had an abusive father, to get me into that mindset of what it is to be a young boy with an overbearing sort of horrible father like that. So I would do targeted reading in that way. And then there was a point where I began reading for plot, and I read people like Jane Harper and Gary Disher and Chris Hammer, and was like, wow, like, look at the work that these people, and I love also like Tana French, Kate Atkinson. And it's interesting, because when the book won a prize here in Australia, that's kind of was the beginning of my publication journey. And the judges said, in the first sentence of the judges' report was, "This is a police procedural that ... And I had no idea that that's kind of what I had written. And I also don't necessarily think that it is a police procedural, because I think the cop character is one of kind of five.
It's an element, yeah.
It's an element, central, but that sense of like, okay, if I've begun, or there's elements of that story, then I want to make sure that I don't hold the reader back from enjoying the story. And that's what I love about mystery, because everything has to do a couple of things. Like, it's a very rigorous genre in that way, in that I wanted to have beautiful sentences and characters that I cared about, and a setting that really moved people and all of that. But at the end of the day, if the story doesn't come together, I worked really hard on that, and I'm proud of that. I was sort of able to figure it out, I hope.
You did a great job. And I really, as someone who's written a number of books over time, I think there's a very special feeling with that first novel, that kind of, not only have you set out to write a book, but you're also kind of feeling your way through this process, and you're setting yourself up. I'm sure you're experiencing this as you write your next one. You've kind of set the foundational stuff for the next book. And I'd love to hear a little bit about the challenges or the surprises that came up as you crafted this debut, because there's a lot, it's very unique, that first novel experience.
Yeah, there was definitely a point. I was just talking about this on a podcast the other day where I nearly gave up. There was 6 months where I was really struggling to write.
Yeah.
And, I had to turn in this book at the end for the PhD. That was how I was earning money at the time. That's what I was living on, my scholarship. And I was like, I just don't know that I can do this. I thought I might be able to be one of these people. And so I think part of being a writer and getting through your first novel is like paying attention to I almost said that idea before of like excavating, what is it that works for me? How do I get it done? And dealing with the fact that I was quite a slow writer was fairly sad for me. Like that was when I just realized like, okay, it just takes me time to kind of get these layers down. George Saunders has this wonderful idea that every perceived weakness also has a corresponding strength. So the fact that, for example, I'm very critical of my own writing, which makes drafting hellish. And I'm not someone who would say that I enjoy writing. I'm not like, I'm sort of sitting there like banging my head against the desk.
It's okay to say that. Yeah, it's not a fun process. I think rewriting is fun, I would say.
Yes, I do love that when you sort of have the meat of the story and then you're making those decisions that really finally kind of tune. It's almost like the Lee Kaufman, an Australian writer, has a great book of writing advice called The Writer Laid Bare. She talks about you're either a builder or a decorator. So you either like building the house, and then the downside of that is you can get bored like before you put all the finishing details on because you're interested in structuring things and making them stand up, or you're a decorator. And I'm so a decorator because all I want to do is like put the rug in, and unfortunately I have to build a house so a rug can go there, whereas I'm like, oh, I want the wall to be that color and the curtains to be this color. And and what's good is I guess it almost gets easier as I go along, which is nice. And then you get to like the structural edit and you're almost renovating the house that you thought you had finished decorating, and then
and it kind of sometimes feels like a game of Jenga almost, like when you get into that editing process and you have to take a piece out and move it and you worry that it's going to tear the whole thing down, but it ends up getting there. I find that every novel is equally challenging in its own way. Like there's just some new wrinkle that you didn't bank on.
And if it wasn't challenging, it wouldn't be new. Like the word novel literally comes from the idea that it's a new concept. Like it doesn't, that even when you're writing, a small town, a girl goes missing in a small town is not a new story, and no story is new. But the way in which the choices I make and the wires that I cross, to tell that story are very, like, ideally haven't happened before. And certainly I was doing them going, oh, I wonder what happens if I cross these two wires, like what's going to spark, basically.
And so you're keeping yourself entertained as well.
Yeah, some days more than others. Some days it's just like, oh,
some days it can be a slog.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that I got to ask my questions, but I know we have a ton of questions in the Q&A live, and also a bunch that readers submitted. So I want to get to those. But before, I want to remind people there's still time to submit your questions if you have them. If you have not picked up your copy of Dirt Creek, please do so either online right now at barnesandnoble.com or at your local B&N, and it'll be there. It just came out in paperback. It's a beautiful book and looks beautiful. I think they did a great job.
It really does. It's such a stunning. We got a new cover for the paperback release, and I really love it. And the funny thing is, like that could be my house where I grew up. It's so funny because the Australian cover I love, but it doesn't really look like the town where I grew up. Whereas the American cover is just so. It's just really funny how that can happen. Like across continents, there can be the fact that the designer was able to kind of go, oh yeah, this is what it's going to look like. And a very early concept photo I had for the cover had this idea of the light kind of streaking by. So it's funny how it's really great. How those things happen.
Yeah. So Scott Carroll asks, can you discuss what you learned in the process of writing this book and what, if anything, you might do differently next time, maybe when you write your next book?
That is a great question, Scott. And I learned that calling myself an idiot over and over and over again, while sort of sometimes oddly satisfying, doesn't actually help the book get written. So finding a way to kind of approach what I'm doing with a bit more, something like gentle curiosity, like, oh, that's interesting. Like, why would those two people be talking? Or whereas I think when I first came to writing, maybe because I knew I had to deliver this book in a certain amount of time, it was that thing of like, oh, idiot, like, why can't you? Like no one's going to
So
care
hard
about
on yourself.
yeah, I think a lot of writers are, and I think
Yeah,
like
it's
I
true.
said, it can be a good thing at the editing stage to go, yeah, like so what, why should the reader care? I do think there can be a good side to having that finely tuned voice, but for me it was a little too finely honed. And
Mhm.
so certainly the greatest pleasure of now writing my second book is I've learned that almost the more I can kind of welcome the ideas or kind of be excited about the story, instead of trying to stop doing something idiotic, just like letting it be on the page and trust that a later version of myself will form the story in a way that I'm proud of and happy with. No, and it's sort of that, I think what's great about being a writer is it is durational. I'm not a ballet dancer. It's not like I've only got a few good years to dance and perform or
Yeah,
something like.
that's one of the appealing things of being a writer. You can do it for
Yeah,
until you're very old.
yeah. So, and I think
Um,
being kind to yourself is almost like a good goal to have every day. So to sort of um, foster that sense of like, okay, I'm gonna approach this and talk to myself like I would talk to someone who I don't hate. Like it really actually helps the writing, I think. Yeah.
yeah, I think so too. And I would say, there's a lot of misconceptions in the advice world. You don't have to write 1,000 words a day. I'm not a proponent of the word count, quota. I think if you wrote and you did, based on all the things we have to do, whether it's family, work, other things, if only we know if we're slacking off. And if you're not slacking off and you're thinking about your book and you're kind of pushing the boulder up the hill, I think you're doing the work, which is important. Um, Another question, I think you answered this a little bit, but maybe we can put more of a point on it. Rhonda Privet asks, did you outline your novel before writing it? Are you a pantser or a planner or a plotter, I guess?
The only time I outlined the novel was when I had already written it. And I don't know if you
The
can see
retroactive outline, yeah.
uh, that is, can you see those like post-it notes off in
Yeah.
that on that wall? I've kind of kept it there. That is Dirt Creek outlined.
Nice.
And there are post-it notes for different point of view. And literally it was like something I heard that writers should do. And I was like, oh no, I haven't done it yet. So I literally had finished the structural edit. I'm like, oh, I should do that. I'll just like have this, outline that I can visually see. So I'm not someone who needs that to start, whereas I know a lot of people are, but it is useful when you're for me, when I'm integrating, I guess, feedback, it's helpful to go, okay, I want to do all of that sounds like it's going to make the story better, but like
Right.
where am I going to do that? So I have done it a bit earlier with the next book, because I go, okay, I want us to know this about the character, so what chapter are we going to find that out in? Whereas I was trying to hold all of that in my head with Dirt Creek, which my head is not big enough for that. So
It's
there was lots
hard.
of
Yeah, I kind of I became an outliner over time. My first novel,
yeah.
which was a PI novel, I knew the ending, but I didn't plot out each chapter. By the middle of the book, I was like, I need a roadmap. And then that became kind of the half-baked outline. And since then my outlines have become much more elaborate as each book comes. So I
Yeah,
don't think
and I
there's
do
an
think,
either or.
yeah, when I first, because I had a PhD supervisor who's like, you should try outlining, like see if you can. And I literally just physically couldn't do it. It was
Yeah.
just the soundtrack of that was just me groaning on the floor, going, how do I,
No.
and it didn't mean that I couldn't write a book. It just meant that was a useful tool for me now. But I
Right.
think with any writing advice or any tool, try it. If it doesn't work, just know that that's totally fine. And that's useful information to know about yourself. And I do want to outline more, because I do think it will make things a bit less stressful in that later editing stage. But I think
Right.
with your first book, there's so much kind of entropy, like there's so many reasons to stop. And so whatever keeps you moving forward, if that's outlining or if it's letting yourself just write the story, then go with that, because that
Yeah.
forward movement is kind of its own kind of good in a way.
Yeah,
It's
I
not
agree.
stopping. Yeah, which is
Yeah,
good.
no. Yeah. And I just want to remind everyone, if you do have a question, just drop it in the Q&A. This is our midday mystery chat with Hayley Scrivenor, author of Dirt Creek, which just came out in paperback, and it's a magnificent debut. I've got a bunch of questions that were submitted, but let's go to the live ones. Oh, this is a good one. I love music questions. Melinda Mauro asks, do you have songs that inspired different characters that you wrote in the book? And if not, this is my addendum. How does music play a part in your writing?
I'm so jealous of people that have playlists. You know, like when people drop a book and then they also drop the like Spotify playlist
Oh, I
that
love
feels
doing
very
that.
curated, and like, you know, like that there's you know, there's kind of songs that are associated. And I mean, I love that. And it's just so not how I approach music when writing. So there's kind of two kinds of music. I listen to the Rocky theme on repeat for about 2 hours every day for about
Just
2
to get in the
years.
zone.
Oh, it was just like dun, 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 you know, because I was so full of fear and like so consumed by the voice in my head that I was like, okay, like this seems to help with that, so let's do that.
That's great.
And and then I kind of now I just listen to songs without music, sorry, songs without words, because so I listen to a lot of like soundtracks from films. The assassination of Jesse James is a good one. It's very atmospheric. And that's involved with Nick Cave, who's a great Australian sort of singer, musician. But also a lot of just like it's so boring. It's like smooth jazz on Spotify. Like it's sort of, and I will take songs out of that playlist if there's people talking or clapping, because the goal is just to get myself into something that looks something like a flow state. And so if the music is kind of I'm not anticipating what the music is doing, I can kind of almost close that tab in my brain and just,
It's
so
funny because I think about music. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I wish it was like cooler than that. And I could sort of, there is in my next book, I've got a Mitski song that I'm thinking about that feels very close to the song, but close to the book. But Dirt Creek, no, there's no, I can't say there's like a cool playlist, sadly.
No, that's okay. It's funny because for me, I can't listen to anything while I'm writing. I can, I'll sometimes put white noise on if, my kids are making a ton of noise, or if there's just a lot of noise. I live in New York, we're on a busy street, so there's always noise. But I do listen to music a lot when thinking about the book. And so I'm always dropping songs into a Spotify playlist, and it can go up to like thousands of songs, and then I whittle it down. So I know when I'm done with the book is when I have the soundtrack down to like maybe a couple hours as opposed to so much.
I love that.
Yeah, it just becomes its own, I take long walks and that's when I think about it, but I have music playing then, but never while I'm writing. I just can't do it while I'm writing.
Did you have a standout song for Secret Identity? Was there like a theme song that you?
Oh, you know what? I have, it doesn't come to mind immediately, but yes,
was it 70? Were you listening to a lot of sort of 70s music?
I was, I listened to a lot of 70s music. I think Cruel Summer was probably like the Taylor Swift song was really in my mind, a lot of stuff like that. So it wasn't just 70 songs on the playlist or the soundtrack, but definitely, that was the one that just kind of comes to mind now.
Cool.
But it's interesting. Mito Taha has asked a bunch of questions, and I want to get to one of theirs. How did you determine point of view, especially when writing a mystery where information, who has it, how it's revealed, and the reliability of POV are so important?
That is a fantastic question, and my PhD was kind of about point of view in fiction, so it's a very dangerous question to ask, but I do think it was very difficult having 5 points of view in my debut novel. I do not recommend doing that, like having 5 points of view, one of whom is like a disembodied collective of children that narrate from this like omniscient kind of position, having 2 adults, 2 kids, but the one upshot of that is that once I had decided what characters we were going to hear from in the story, this sense of what is great about having 5 points of view is you can always go with who has the most interesting vantage point on the story. Right. And that was really helpful for me in the mystery in the end. It really helped me maintain that kind of momentum. We're often like learning something and then going to the next character and hopefully being hooked into kind of the next part of the story. But there's less, my next book is totally in the first person. And so you having to jump more or find other ways to keep the story kind of progressing in that way. Whereas, I loved it with Dirt Creek. You could just cut to, and sometimes we see the same event from multiple points of view. I try not to do that too often. But when it happens, it's really satisfying because each time we're learning something that we need to kind of unlock the mystery. So I do think for me, actually, point of view, once I've figured out who's speaking and almost why they're speaking from that vantage point, that's like when the novel begins to sort of unfold for me. I think the point of telling is incredibly important in the way I think about the story. And often
the
it
medium
ends
is
up
the
having,
message, I guess. Yeah.
it ends up having something to do with the plot. So an example would be, I've got two sort of point of view child narrators, Ronnie and Lewis. And because I was telling the story from their point of view, and I wanted to take children seriously. Like, I think we often talk about children and childhood as a time of innocence, right? But I remember being quite an anxious child and being very aware of kind of what was going on around me and not having much power over changing that. And so in deciding that I wanted to approach those children characters quite seriously and really take their concerns seriously, they ended up kind of inflecting the plot. Like, the plot became much more, they have a big part to play in the plot. What they think and what they believe about what's happening actually drives the action in a way that I didn't necessarily anticipate when I started taking them seriously. You know what I mean?
No, and I really appreciated that, not as, I mean, clearly as not as a child myself, but as, someone who deals with children, young children, my kids all the time. I love how you carried that voice through the book. It didn't feel like an afterthought, which I think sometimes happens. The kids are window dressing or B characters, but not really fully developed. So I thought that was really well done.
Thank you.
There's no question in there, just a compliment. But
yeah, that's great. I'll take it.
Yeah. So another question from Lori Johnson. She asks, how do you pace yourself while writing a new novel? What does your writing schedule typically look like?
That is also a good question. Sorry, that's my response to all questions, because I love being asked about process in particular. Like, I love other people's writing routines. I could endlessly listen to how other people write books. For me, what really works right now when I'm in the editing stage is, and I'm lucky enough to write full time at the moment. I haven't got other major teaching commitments or other things like that. So I try and do 3 hours of creative work a day. But that is, I have to work up to that, and I don't always get there. And I have a little this little timer that I use.
Oh wow.
And so I'll do it in either half hour or hour little timed blocks, because I do not want to sit here. I do not want to think about the book. I want to be outside. I want to be drinking tea. I want to be doing anything else.
Yeah.
So for me to have a visual timer really helps, to be like, no, look, you've got another 15 minutes, just concentrate on what you're doing. And sometimes I'll spend part of that 3 hours literally reading another book, and I try not to let myself be too liberal in that, but sometimes I'll just read a passage of writing that I love to get the motor running and kind of get a sentence or two out. But the idea is my body gets used to the fact that it's going to sit here for that time, and that it can either write the book or not write the book. That's fine. Sometimes that happens, but we're going to sit here. But that's been a long time.
Time spent thinking is as good as time spent writing a lot of the time.
Yeah, and I do think time away from the desk is incredibly important, but because I'm on deadline for this next book, I guess it's that feeling of, that feels like the maximum I can do in a day, so let's try and kind of do that and see if we can get there. But when I was first in the first draft, I do get a bit 700 words a day was the minimum that I was kind of trying to do when I just wanted to get a draft of the next book down before Dirt Creek came out, because I think people give that advice that it's good to kind of get into the next book before people start talking about your first book, because then for the first time you're aware of the reader, and I think that can mess with your head a little bit.
It can, yes, for sure.
So yeah, but I think what I figured out is the morning is my golden time. If I can talk to no one before sort of before 11 a.m, then I'm happy, to the point that I'm quite mean to my partner sometimes. I'm like, don't talk to I lock myself away. But I also remember when I was doing my PhD and working 2 jobs, and I could only work on the book for 10 minutes a day sometimes, or there was a 6-month period where I didn't write. I think it was all part of the beauty of a novel, is that it kind of expands to receive everything that you have for it. So I think the 6 months I spent not writing the novel is in the book as much as kind of those really concentrated period of time where it looks like I'm writing,
Yeah. Not to get cheesy about it. It's almost like it's a quilt of things and experiences that happen during the writing. Like whether, there's those marathons where you're writing every day and it kind of chugging along. And then there's, like you said, long stretches where you're not writing, but you're thinking about writing, and it all is cumulative. And it becomes this thing, this printout of hundreds of pages that you didn't really fathom you could do. The
And one
next
thing I try and
question,
tell,
yeah,
sorry, just emerging writers in particular, is like it never once, and you can comment on this, but it never once felt like I was writing a book. It always felt like I was
yeah,
trying to write a book. And then
yeah,
at some point, 6 years later, I had written a book. Like that is
right.
just what it feels like in my body. Like I'm never like, yes, here I am, finishing my novel. It just does not. And that's the easiest, that's what's easier about writing the second book, is that I know it doesn't have to feel like I'm writing a book. It's just as long as I'm finding a way to show up for it at least some of the time,
Yeah, and I
it's
find that
something is happening.
it's really stressful when you think about it as a whole, when you're like, I'm writing a novel, especially at the beginning, and even towards the end I was like, am I ever going to finish with my new book, the follow up to Secret Identity? It feels like, oh, is it ever going to get to the end? And it's much easier to think about it in chunks, whether of words or chapters or little pieces, and then you kind of see it together. But um yeah, just a reminder, if you want to pick up a copy of Dirt Creek, you can do it at your local Barnes and Noble or do it online. And, we do still have time for some questions. So I see that some are clocking in, and I'm going through a lot of the ones that were submitted. These are three questions that I'm going to merge into one, from Gina Ritchie, Kathy Hargrove, and Karen DeBraccio. And they're both about your child. They're all three are about your childhood and reading. When did your love of reading begin? What books were part of that? And what authors were influential to you as a child reading? So when did your love start, and what were the books and authors that really resonated for you?
I mean, I did, and there's photos of me as a kid reading and holding the book like upside down, right? Like I loved the concept of books, I think,
Mm-hmm.
even before I could read, and I loved being read to. And my mum had those books on Disney books on tape. So once she thought I was like this child genius because I was reading Snow White. And then I went, there's a sound that they make when it's time to turn the page. And I went da 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 da, like I made the noise because as I had just like memorized the book and then was like doing the pages.
That's great.
So I was kind of in love with the concept of reading, and I still am. I mean, I think for me, I started, a lot of my books came from secondhand stores. And so I loved Enid Blyton. I loved Trixie Belden. And now looking back, I'm like, of course, those are mystery novels. Like they're mystery novels for kids, but they are, even Enid Blyton, like they're always kind of on this, they're trying to figure out what's happened or understand something about the world or kind of set or right some wrong, So it's quite clear to me the line between those sort of early reads. But like I said, I also loved Adrian Mole. I don't know if that's big in the US, but he's a sort of English, it's comedy. Mm-hmm. It's like comedy writing. Again, so I liked books that were funny. But I think what was great is that I read pretty much everything, like whatever was 50 cents. And that's where I spent all of my pocket money. My mum would let me loose in the secondhand store, and I would just, I loved acquiring, I still love acquiring books. I have so many books in my house. And I always say I don't have a book problem, I have a bookshelf problem, like I don't have enough bookshelves. So I think reading everything. Also in primary school, I had a big crush on my librarian. So I read all these big fancy books that I didn't understand to try and
impress them.
Yeah. I wanted her to think that I was really smart,
That's great.
So just reading like Wuthering Heights and I was like, what is wrong with these people? Like, at 9, you don't understand like toxic love, right? You're just like, have a cup of tea and calm down, like have a biscuit.
Yeah, just hash it out. Yeah.
So that's probably a terrible answer to that question, but it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, this idea that you kind of suck up all these influences and they become embedded in your brain. But yeah, I think like Enid Blyton, definitely, for better or worse. I know parts of her are not readable now, but
I mean, our influences are what they are. I mean, I picked up the Godfather novel when I was 8 or 9, and I probably should not have been reading that book at that time, but it all worked out fine. I mean, it had a huge, here it all happened. So, I mean, your influences are what they are. And we're kind of winding down on time. So I found this question particularly interesting. So I'd love to hear your answer. What was the hardest scene for you to write in Dirt Creek? Obviously, we want to steer clear of spoilers, but if there's one that's a little spoiler free that you can share, that's from Abina Miles with the question.
There are definitely scenes I remember finding it difficult, like, and it's almost like you're running towards the hurdle, and then at the last second you kind of you're like, oh no, not today, like I can't do that today. But I think the character that happened with most, and that I can talk about without spoilers, because a lot of those scenes are would be spoilery.
Yeah.
So Constance is a character who kind of goes home from work, is waiting for her daughter to come home, and she's 5 minutes late, she's 10 minutes late, she's half an hour late, she's 4 hours late. She was such a difficult character to sit with, because literally from the moment we meet her, everything in her life is kind of falling apart. And I think even if you don't have a child, everyone knows that experience of someone you love not being where they're supposed to be in physical space. You're trying to get someone on the phone, or they're not back when they should be. And I think that experience, my brother has an intellectual disability, and he used to run off a lot. It was like part of what he would do. And so it was like sitting in that feeling and that fear and that anxiety. I mean, there's 12 years between us, so I would often be like responsible for him, and it would be terrifying. Like half a second and you would turn away, and it was like that. So sitting in that feeling for like the length of a whole book. And that's one of the other advantages of having multiple points of view, because I can also give the reader a break from that, but every time we drop into Constance, it's quite a difficult. There are other things sort of like, it's the worst week of her life. Like there are so many things kind of going wrong for Constance. So I think anytime I sat down to write her, I kind of had to tap into some that difficult feelings. Yeah.
It's hard, but then I think that's really when you don't want to say you're trauma mining, because I think a lot of times there's that expectation that as authors, we have to really dig deep into our own trauma, especially with marginalized voices. I think the expectation is that we can only write to our trauma, but I think there's a lot to be said about tapping into our experiences to give that authentic feeling when we're writing. I
think on that level, Lewis as a character was someone, he was really a vessel I could put, I guess, knowing I was a queer kid in a small country town, giving it to someone it was really, and I don't think this is a spoiler, but Lewis was the character was most important for me, got a happy ending. He kind of, and that was really quite cathartic. Like I don't think writing has to be cathartic at all. And like you, but I do think if you're feeling something as a writer, when you're writing something, then often I do think the reader can get a glimmer of that on the other side. So
yeah, they can feel it, and that's the hope. That's the connection with the reader. And I think that's a really special note to kind of end on. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And was there anything I missed that you wanted to touch on with the book?
No, thank you so much. It's always lovely talking to someone who has read the book with care and kind of asked great questions. So I really appreciate, and I really did love your book, and it's nice to be in conversation with someone who's writing that you like. So I would just remind everyone to check out Secret Identity.
Thank you so much.
It is a banger.
Thank you. That is the highest praise. And yes, Dirt Creek, you can grab Dirt Creek at your local Barnes & Noble. It is the monthly mystery pick at Barnes & Noble, or you can buy it on barnesandnoble.com if you just want to do it from the comforts of your home. But it's a really fantastic debut. I was so honored to be in conversation with you, Hayley, and thanks for taking the time. And thanks to everyone that asked amazing questions and was able to watch.
And thank you again, Alex. And also thank you to Barnes & Noble. I had no idea when I wrote this book about the small country town where I grew up that it would one day be in stores across the US. Like, it's incredibly, incredibly exciting at my end to know that people are finding it over there, thanks to BNN. So thank you very much. And this has been really fun, a really great conversation.
Yeah, take care. Thanks for writing an amazing book, and congrats. And I hope everyone who hasn't read it enjoys it. And take care, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.